The Venetian mirror reflected a woman who no longer recognized herself. 60 years, shaking hands, holding a pearl necklace that had cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. And in their eyes, that family emptiness, the same one that had been with her since she was a child. Paris's Ritz, presidential suite, gold-covered walls, and the heavy silence of those who spent a whole fortune trying to buy something that money could never give, a love that would not run away when the jewelry lost its shine. Barbara Hutton knew she was dying, not from any disease that doctors could name, but of the slow exhaustion of having lived as an object of desire for so long that he'd forgotten how to exist as a person. If you appreciate stories about the dark side of wealth and how luxury can become a golden prison, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the forgotten corners of the elite, where glamour hides silent tragedies that echo today. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born on November 14, 1912, in New York, heiress of two of the biggest American fortunes. She was a granddaughter of Frank Woolworth, founder of the chain of stores that had transformed cheap objects into a commercial empire, and daughter of Franklin Law's Hutton, the stock market. His birth coincided with the height of the American Golden Age, when industrial fortunes created dynasties that rival European nobility. But wealth, would discover Barbara, it may be the cruel of inheritance. Quinta Avenida apartment breathed silent opulence. Carrara marble, French tapestries, baccarat crystals that captured light as transparent arrests. Barbara grew between these precious objects, a living doll in a museum house where each surface was polished until she reflects not reality, but an idealized version of her. At the age of 4, he was already wearing hand-embroidered dresses by Parisian seamstresses and had a housekeeper for each day of the week. But behind the luxury curtain, something rotted. His mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, had turned into a melancholy shadow, lost in depressions that even money could not heal. The father, always absent, lived plunged into the scholarship numbers, as if the daughter were just another investment to be managed. Barbara learned early that love was something that bought with good looks and exemplary behavior. When he smiled at the formal dinners, he received gifts. When he cried, he was sent to his rooms. The child began to understand that his existence had value only when he was ornamental, a beautiful accessory in the lives of the adults around her. The tragedy that would define his life arrived on a cold morning of May 1917. Barbara, at the age of 4, found her mother in the pink marble bathroom, killed after an overdose of medicines. Suicide was officially called accident, but the child knew that something terrible had happened in that space where luxury had not been able to prevent the pain from winning. At that moment, Barbara Hutton learned the first and most devastating lesson of her life, that not all the wealth in the world can fill the emptiness left by the absence of true love. Even more cruel, she began to believe that maybe it was her guilt. After all, if she was more beautiful, more perfect, more worthy of love, maybe her mother had stayed. At 5, Barbara became one of the richest children in the world. The Woolworth heritage turned it into a symbol of the American aristocracy, but also a target. Her photographs began to appear in the newspapers with subtitles like "The Princess of the 5 and Centons," a cruel reference to the empire built by her grandfather selling cheap objects. The father, emotionally devastated by the death of his wife, handed Barbara to the care of a succession of rules and tutors. The girl grew up in empty palaces, surrounded by adults paid to take care of her, but never to love her. Each birthday brought more extravagant gifts: Arabs, family jewelry, trips to Europe, but never the present she wanted most. Someone who chose her not for money, but for who she was. Barbara learned to read the language of the self, serving before you even know how to write your full name. I saw how people's eyes changed when they found out who it was, how smiles became brighter and sweeter voices. He began to realize that his wealth was simultaneously his greatest attraction and his greatest curse. She would never know if she was loved by herself or her fortune. As a teenager, Barbara already showed signs of what her obsession would become: the desperate search for beauty and perfection. He spent hours preparing for social events, experiencing dresses, jewelry, hairstyles. Each public appearance was a test. Would it be accepted, admired, or would you see that cold and calculating look that reduced it to a bank amount? The cruelty of New Yorker society was soon manifested. At the latter, being years old, Barbara was already called the richest girl in the world, but also whispered she was strange, lonely, difficult. The press began to portray her as a spoiled eccentric, unable to relate to normal people. What they didn't know was that Barbara had developed a coldness armor as a defense mechanism. If she didn't allow herself to truly love, she might not suffer as her mother had suffered. In 1933, at the age of 21, Barbara married Prince Alexis Mdivani, a charming and bankrupt Georgian who saw the perfect opportunity to restore her personal fortune. The ceremony at Plaza Hotel was a show of ostentation, rare flowers, chamber music, high society guests. But those who watched carefully see that the bride seemed more scared than happy. Alexis was all Barbara believed a husband should be: handsome, aristocratic, European, sophisticated. He treated her like a princess, covered her with attention and passionate statements. But Barbara, even in her naivete, began to realize that Alexis's caresses had the same quality as those of jewelry sellers, were calculated, performic, interested. The honeymoon was a tour of the European capitals, Barbara being displayed as a trophy in the arms of her prince. In Paris, Alexis took her to the haute casuals where she spent fortunes on dresses she would wear only once. In Venice, he organized extravagant dinners in rented palaces, always surrounded by friends who seemed more interested in champagne expensive than in the hostess's company. Barbara began to realize that she had bought a husband, not conquered a love. Alexis treated her with love, but it was the affection that is dedicated to a valuable object, careful, respectful, but distant. At night, when he slept beside him, Barbara was awake, looking at the ceiling, feeling more alone than ever. He had a husband, a social position, more money than he could spend on several lives, but he was hollow inside. The marriage lasted only 2 years. Alexis left Barbara for a French actress, taking with her a substantial amount as a divorce agreement. The press dealt with separation as entertainment, Barbara being portrayed alternately as a naive victim or fatal woman unable to hold a man. She read each article, every cruel speculation about her personality, her appearance, her inadequacy as a wife. The separation taught Barbara a terrible lesson. Even when I could buy company, I couldn't buy loyalty. He began to understand that his wealth functioned as a magnet, attracting people, but also as a barrier, preventing someone from approaching her as a real, vulnerable human person. The heart collector. The second marriage came in 1935 with Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat who promised to make Barbara what she wanted most, a true love and a place in the European nobility. The ceremony was even more great than the first, but Barbara had already learned that the greater the public spectacle, the greater the private emptiness. Kurt was different from Alexis, more serious, more intellectual, apparently less interested in Barbara's fortune. He talked about art, literature, philosophy, and for a moment Barbara believed he had found someone who valued her for her mind, not just for her wallet. They moved to a castle in Denmark, where Barbara tried to build the fairy tale life she had always imagined. But reality turned out to be dark. Kurt was a controller and possessive, treated Barbara as a precious doll that should be displayed when convenient and stored when not. He managed his finances, decided his clothes, chose his friends. Barbara, who had spent her life trying to buy autonomy, found that she had sold her freedom by a fake crown. The birth of his only son, Lance, in 1936, brought Barbara a joy that he has not known since childhood. Finally, there was someone to love unconditionally, someone who needed her not for money, but for motherhood. But even this happiness was contaminated by the toxic dynamics of your marriage. Kurt used the child as a control instrument, threatening to restrict Barbara's access to her son when she did not behave as he expected. Barbara began to understand that she had become a golden prisoner. He lived in palaces, wore jewelry of incalculable value, was called a countess, but had no right to his own opinions, his own choices, his own life. Each day it was a carefully choreographed performance to maintain the appearances of a perfect marriage, while inside it was loneliness and frustration. World War II brought a pretext for separation. Barbara returned to the United States with Bid, officially to escape the European conflict. In fact, to escape a Qassam that had become a sophisticated form of house arrest. The divorce was finalized in 1941, once again with Barbara paying a substantial amount for his freedom. Free from Kurt, Barbara embarked on an increasingly frantic journey in search of the love that had always escaped her. At almost 30, I had understood that the money did not buy happiness, but still could not stop trying. Each new relationship was a desperate bet. Maybe this time it was different. Maybe this time you would find someone who truly loved her. Cary Grant entered her life as a promise of redemption. The actor was handsome, talented, seemingly genuine in his interest in her. Barbara fell in love not only with man, but with the idea that she had finally found someone whose fame and success would protect her from fortune hunters. They were married in 1942 in a simple ceremony that dramatically contrasted with the previous shows. For a brief period, Barbara experienced something like genuine happiness. Grant treated her as a real woman, not as a symbol or a bank account. They traveled together, laughed together, seemed to have found a balance between two famous people trying to build something authentic away from the spotlight. But not even Cary Grant was immune to the corruption that Barbara's fortune exerted on relationships. Gradually, she began to realize that he had also changed, becoming more interested in his business, his investments, his social connections. The man she had loved for her independence was becoming a sophisticated dependent. The separation was silent and melancholy. There were no scandals, there were no dramatic betrayals, just the slow recognition that even genuine love could survive the weight of such a great fortune. Barbara and Grant divorced in 1945, she again rich in cash and poorer in hope. Barbara began to understand that she was cursed by her own wealth. Each person who approached her was inevitably corrupted by money, turning from lover into dependent, partner to parasite. She was like King Midas, except that everything she played became not gold, but in greed. The following years were a blur of desperate marriages and bitter separations. Rubirosa Porfirio, the Dominican playboy who, collecting rich women like others, collecting stamps. Igor Trubetskoy, another impoverished European prince in search of a rich American to restore his fortune. Lloyd Franklin, a German aristocrat who promised stability but delivered just another variation of the same theme. Each marriage followed the same pattern. Initial passion based on promises of true love, extravagant honeymoon in exotic destinations, gradual honeymoon revealing financial interest, costly and humiliating separation. Barbara became a cruel joke in social circles, the woman who could not buy a husband who stayed, the heiress who collecting divorces as others collect jewelry. But what society did not see was the process of slow self-destruction that each failed marriage represented. Barbara began to drink to endure loneliness, taking medications to sleep, to isolate themselves more and more from the world that judged her without understanding her. Each new separation was not just the end of a relationship, but confirmation of its worst suspicions about itself, which was fundamentally unable to be loved. The press was delighted with each new scandal, every new separation, every new evidence of Barbara's inadequacy as a woman. It was portrayed as a tragic figure, but also as a comic figure, the woman who had everything except the ability to keep a man. The articles speculated on their intimate inadequacies, their emotional coldness, their neurotic obsession with marriage. Barbara read every word, absorbed every criticism as if it were true revealed. He began to believe that perhaps the newspapers were right, that there was something fundamentally wrong with her. Maybe it was very rich, very independent, very complicated for any man to truly love her. Perhaps his mother was right to choose death instead of continuing to live in a world where love was always conditional. In the 1960s, Barbara gradually removed from public life. He bought a series of isolated properties, a palace in Tangier, a villa in the French Riviera, an apartment in Paris, where he could live away from curious eyes and poisonous languages. Each property was decorated with the same obsessive luxury of his childhood, as if it could build a cocoon of beauty sufficiently thick to protect it from reality. His days became elaborate automature rituals, hours spent on beauty treatments, sessions with masseurs, consultations with medicals specialized in PRE serving the youthful appearance. Barbara had become obsessed with the idea that if she could stay beautiful enough, she might still find the love she had always sought. But the mirror did not lie. Barbara saw her appearance changing, saw the lines deepening around her eyes, saw the skin losing the elasticity that even the more expensive treatments could restore completely. Each physical change was a reminder that time was passing, that their chances of finding true love diminished every day. She began to surround himself with a small circle of loyal employees and a few friends who seemed genuinely concerned about their well-being. But even these relationships were contaminated by the dynamics of power that their wealth created. How could she know if the affection of her housekeeper was real or bought? If your doctor's concern was genuine or self-interested? Paranoia settled slowly. Barbara began to suspect everyone around her, seeing financial interest in every gesture of affection, calculism in each expression of concern. He installed elaborate security systems, changed his will repeatedly, fired employees on unfounded suspicions. The woman, who had always wanted to be loved, had become unable to trust any demonstration of affection. Barbara developed an obsessive routine of personal care that consumed hours of each day, facial treatments with the most expensive products in the world, massage with rare oils, exercise with private coaches, consultations with the most renowned plastic surgeons in Europe. She spent more on maintenance of her appearance than most people earn in a lifetime. But behind the obsession with beauty was a growing despair. Barbara believed that if she could stay young and attractive enough, she might still find the love she had always sought. Each treatment was a bet against time, each procedure an attempt to buy a few more years of romantic possibilities. The irony was cruel. The more money spent trying to preserve her beauty, the more she became a caricature of herself. The skin was too stretched by procedures, the hair kept in colors that were no longer natural to her age, the elegant clothes that looked like fantasies, and a body that agreed, despite all efforts. Barbara looked in the mirror and saw as strange. The reflected woman had all the marks of wealth-perfect jewelry, impeccable makeup, couture clothes, but had lost something essential in the process. Spontaneity had been polished until it disappeared, naturalness had been refined until it became artificial. She had become an expensive work of art, but she was no longer a real person. His latest relationships were with men younger decades, sophisticated gigols who treated her with the courtesy professional of luxury escorts. Barbara knew exactly what they were, but preferred the brutal honesty of a commercial transaction to the hypocrisy of the fortune hunters who pretended true love. Barbara's final years have been marked by increasingly deep isolation. She spent months without leaving her properties, communicating with the outside world only through intermediaries. His only regular visitors were doctors, lawyers, and employees, never genuine friends, never a family who cares about her as a person. She developed a series of phobias and obsessions that made her life even more restricted. Fear of germs made her wear gloves constantly. Paranoia about poisoning led her to eat only foods prepared by her personal cook. Horror of being photographed her away from any public event. The woman who had passed youth being photographed to society magazines now ran away from any camera as if they were weapons. Barbara began to understand that she had become a prisoner of her own wealth. The money that should give her freedom had created a golden cage from which she couldn't escape. Each decision in your life was influenced by financial considerations. Each relationship was contaminated by material interest. Every moment of happiness was shaded by the suspicion that it was bought, not genuine. She wrote letters she never sent, thoughts about her life that no one would read. In these pages, Barbara revealed a painful lucidity about her situation. She had spent a fortune trying to buy love and only managed to prove that true love is priceless because it is not for sale. In his most lucid moments, Barbara acknowledged that she had become the victim of her own wealth. Money had corrupted all their relationships, turning each person into their life into a dependent or an explorer. She had lost the ability to distinguish between genuine affection and financial interest because, in her experience, this distinction had de-axed from existing. Barbara Hutton died on May 11, 1979, at age 66, in her apartment at Ritz de Paris. The woman who had inherited one of the biggest fortunes in the world died practically bankrupt, having spent everything on a desperate search for something that money could not buy. Her last years had been spent in hotel rooms paid by friends, dependent on the charity of people she had helped in the past. The final irony was that at the time of his death, Barbara was closer to genuine humanity than he had been in decades. With no money to impress or corrupt, the few people who remained by his side did so for genuine compassion, not for material interest. But she was too young to enjoy this cruel irony. His funeral was a modest ceremony, very different from the grandiose shows that marked their marriages. Few people attended, some loyal employees, few acquaintances who remembered their generosity, none of the ex-husbands who had benefited from their fortune. The woman who had spent her life trying to buy love went to the grave, surrounded only by those who loved her without expectations. The inheritance that Barbara left was mainly debts and regrets. Her son Lance, who had grown away from her due to the complexities of her tumultuous life, got just beyond painful memories of a mother who had tried to buy her affection as she had tried to buy that of all others. The magnificent jewelry, the haute couture dresses, the art objects that had collected throughout a life were sold in auctions, dispersed to new owners who would value them for price, not for the tears that had bought them. Like their own life, these precious possessions became commodities, devoid of the emotional context that had given them meaning. Barbara Hutton's life reveals a disturbing truth about the nature of extreme wealth and her relationship with human love. In a company that equates financial value with personal value, she became a prisoner of her own fortune, unable to experience genuine relationships because her wealth inevitably corrupted them. His obsession with beauty in marriage was not superficial vanity, but a desperate attempt to find something authentic in a world where everything around him was mediated by money. Each beauty treatment, every failed wedding, every extravagant purchase was a silent scream, "Can anyone love me for whom I am, not what I have?" Barbara's tragedy was not only personal but cultural. She lived at a time when a woman's value was measured by her ability to attract and maintain a man, and when this strategy repeatedly failed, society blamed her for her inadequacy, rather than questioning a system that reduced human relationships to financial transactions. Its history echoes to this day in an era of social networks where appearance is constantly performed, where relationships are mediated by material considerations, where loneliness and depression coexist paradoxically with constant digital connection. Barbara Hutton was an involuntary precursor of modern malaise, the feeling that, despite all the possibilities and resources at our disposal, something essential about the human connection was lost. In the end, Barbara Hutton was not the victim of her wealth, but of a world that could not imagine value beyond the financial, love beyond transactional, beauty beyond the superficial. She spent her life trying to buy what can only be given freely, and died understanding that true poverty is not the lack of money, but the lack of someone who loves us for what we are when all masks fall. His last image, an elderly woman looking into a Venetian mirror, seeing decades of frustrated hope reflected back, remains as a haunted symbol in all ways as we confuse price with value, possess with love, shine with being seen. Barbara Hutton, the richest woman of her generation, died as one of the poorest, not in money, but in everything that really matters.